see you. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. I want to see you. Holy, Lord. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy Lord. Holy, holy, holy. I want to see you. To see you high lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing holy, holy, holy. Sing love, how can it be that you, my King, would die for me? Amazing love, I know it's true. It's my joy to honor you. In all I do, I honor you. I'm forgiven because you were forsaken. I'm accepted. You were condemned. I'm alive and well. Your spirit is within me because you died and rose again. Amazing love, how can it be that you, my King, would die for me? Amazing love, I know it's true. It's my joy to honor you. Amazing love, how can it be that you, my King, would die for me? You have overcome the grave. Glory fills the highest place. What can separate me and the cross? And the cross I bow my knee, where your blood was shed for me. There's no greater love than me. You have overcome the grave. Glory fills the highest place. What can separate me
Greetings, church. You thought I was going to say shalom, huh? Shalom, church. It's good to see you today on this beautiful Sunday, and any Sunday where we can get together as a church family and worship together and recognize what Christ has done for us in our lives is a beautiful Sunday. Amen? So, we're getting back to the text today, and just want to welcome you one more time if you're here for the first time. My name is Vasily, and one of the pastors here at Good News Church, and we are glad that you're here with us, with our church family. As we're studying all 66 books of the Bible, we're kind of doing an overview of the Bible. In a chronological order, we're going through things as they happened and focusing on some key events. And we're trying to do that from a Christ-centered perspective. We want to see how all of Scripture, through New Testament and Old Testament, how it all points to Jesus Christ. And today, we're going to look at a really cool story. We're going to look at a story of David and Jonathan. Now, this story is a great story of biblical friendship. It is a great story of a friendship that the Scriptures shows us as an example that is a true friendship, that is a true friendship that has elements that are very important for us to understand and to identify. And together with you today, I want to talk today about friendship. I want to see what real friendship, what true friendship in a biblical context really means. In fact, it is my hope that you walk away here today with a solid understanding that God's people need godly relationships in their lives. God's people need godly relationships in their lives. And we have a great example of that. It's an encouraging story, but it is a challenging story. It is a story that challenges us to look at relationships, at friendships, differently perhaps than we have been looking at before. Because right now we live in an age of shallow relationships. We live in an age where relationships are just completely superficial. In fact, if I was to ask you, how many friends do you have? Most of you would immediately think of what? What kind of friends? Be honest, Facebook, right? And you're thinking, okay, 300, 400, maybe 1,000. If you're really popular, maybe a couple of thousand people, right? But most of you have a few hundred friends, 300, 400 acquaintances, maybe. Now, I have a confession to make. I don't know some people on my friends list, on my Facebook friends list. Is there anybody here who really knows every person on their friends list on Facebook? Raise your hand. I want to get to know you. Okay, you, and you. We got to have a meeting after the second service. You're gonna help me. You're gonna help me weed some of those things out. Okay, you're gonna help me work through my friends list. There's got to be some sort of criteria that defines it, right? But the reality is, we have people who, ask to be your friend, and you're thinking, well, if maybe I can influence them for Christ, I can share some things with them. Sure, click OK. And then in the back of my mind, I have a friend. I'm teaching my kids, my daughters, she's my bestest friend. And I said, well, what about this girl? Oh, she's my second bestest friend. I said, well, what about this girl? Oh, she was my best friend last year. Like, okay, well, it doesn't really work like that. We live in an age of relationships that don't go very deep. They just go wide. They get wider and wider and wider, but they don't really get deeper. My question to you is, how many of your friends, Facebook or otherwise, do you really know? You know what drives them? You know what motivates them? You know what their values are in life? You know what struggles they're going through? You know what challenges they have? How many of those people would you actually invite to your birthday party? 400? Maybe a little less, right? Now, Tim Keller, he provided a great definition of a friendship that I really liked and I want to share with you. He said that there are two main components of a great friendship, two main features of a true friendship. Constancy, it's how consistently you are dedicating yourself to somebody, how regularly you are committed to them, and transparency, how open you are with them, whether they really know who you are. I've asked you earlier whether you know most of your friends. Another question also is true, is how many of those friends really know the real you? What motivates and drives you, what is important to you, what your values are. And so we're going to look at the example of friendship that really does have an example of constancy and the example of transparency. And that's in the story of David and Jonathan. And then, after we take a look at those two things, we're going to see how it all connects to Jesus Christ, how it points to Christ in this great relationship. So let's open our Bibles together, and let's start with chapter 18 of the first book of Samuel. In the Russian Bible, it's First Kings, but in the English translation, it's 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 to 3. 1, 2, and 3. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And so what's happening here? Let's take a look at the context. Let's take a look at the background of what's happening here. We see some familiar characters in this story. Saul, who is the current reigning king. He is the guy in charge. He is the guy who runs the nation. Then you have Jonathan, who is the son of the current king. In fact, Jonathan is in line to be king next after his father. That's how it works, from father to son, right? So he would be expected to take over the throne if his father was to die in battle, or he would just get old and pass that on. That would be the natural line of succession. And then we have David, who is the youngest of all the sons in his family, but he's also the one who was actually anointed by Samuel, the prophet, to be the next king. God, through Samuel, anointed David to be the king. And last Sunday, we studied with you the story of David and Goliath. We studied what motivated David and why he was actually fighting Goliath and what that story was about. And what we can see now is that David is becoming popular. He's done an amazing job with Goliath. He is the underdog. He won that amazing victory for the people of Israel, and he's becoming pretty popular. In fact, people are singing songs. They're writing songs about David. They're writing songs about Saul. And guess what? Something happens that every leader doesn't like. They get compared to somebody else. There's a little bit of a comparison going on between Saul and David. If you take a look at verse 7, here's what the song that the women were singing was saying. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David, his 10,000s. In other words, Saul's doing a great job. He's good. He's a good king. But David, oh man, 10 times better. Amazing. Do you think he likes that? Would it bother you if you were Saul in that situation and you know, Bob, Michael, James, whoever, you're doing a good job, but man, this guy 10 times better. How would you feel? Guess what? Saul starts getting angry. He starts feeling unhappy about it. He starts looking at David as a problem, as a potential replacement for himself. In fact, if we take a look further down, verses 8 through 9, it says this, "And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him." He wasn't happy about being compared to David, who was really a nobody. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. In other words, Saul is looking at David and saying, you know what? People are telling amazing stories about David. And there is no way but up for him. And what's next? He's already got the respect of the people, the love of the people. The next thing he's going to want is what? The kingdom. And so he's keeping an eye on him. That's what that last verse, "And Saul eyed David from day on." He kept an eye on him. He was watching him. There is worriness there. There is a concern there. And so through this, we can see that Jonathan becomes friends with David. Jonathan and David are buddies, and Saul is not allowing David to go back home. In fact, it's probably one of those sayings that, have you ever heard, keep your friends close, but your enemies what? Closer, right? That's what Saul is doing. He is looking at David, he's seeing a potential problem, and he is keeping him at the house. Jonathan and David are buddies, and Saul is not letting David to go home. He is keeping him close. And Jonathan's relationship with David is really unusual. It's unusual because Jonathan was, as I said, next in line for the throne that Saul sat on. And so David, the potential problem for Saul, and Jonathan, the person who is supposed to inherit the throne, the person who is supposed to be the next king, even though he was the next in line, even though he was the next one in line for succession, he was not the one who was anointed by Samuel to be king. That was David. God said that David would be the next king. And so it's more likely for Jonathan and David to be enemies. They have something to lose. They have something that goes contrary to their interests. There's supposed to be expected competition. There is expected conflict between them two. But instead, they have a friendship. And in fact, the Bible says that they have a covenant commitment or a covenant relationship with one another. They're not just somebody that hangs out with one another once in a while. They have a covenant relationship, a covenant commitment towards one another. And that's the first characteristic of a true friendship that I want you to walk away with here today, is that a true friendship, a real relationship is based on a covenant and not on other things. It's a covenant relationship, covenant commitment. And we didn't use that word very often, so it might be, well, what's a covenant? Is that a contract? They both start with a C. They both kind of outline the things people are supposed to do. Because we're familiar with contracts very well, but we're not familiar with covenants as well. And so contracts are very different from covenants. Contracts, they focus on limitations. They focus on the things that people are supposed to do, they're expected to do, and here's what happens when you don't do them. Here's what happens when the other party doesn't fulfill their obligations. In fact, when you don't do your obligations, when you don't follow your obligations, I will stop my obligations. That's a contract. Let me give you a real life example. You rent out a house, and the contract is the landlord provides the house, and the tenant pays the rent. There is a contract. If you don't pay the rent, guess what happens? You get evicted, right? You don't have a house to live in. And the other way around, if the house is no longer available, do you have to pay the rent? Yes or no? No, it's a contract. Both parties have a sense of responsibilities. And we're very familiar with contracts. They're everywhere. And they are necessary for clarity. They're necessary for businesses to function. They're necessary to resolve disputes and move forward. But here's the problem. The problem is that sometimes we start treating our close relationships as relationships based on a contract and not a covenant. We start looking at people around us as a contract, as a set of expectations that they're supposed to do this and I'm supposed to do this, and that's how it's going to work. We start looking at people at what they can do for us and how they can meet our needs. We do that with our friends. We do that with our acquaintances. We even do that with our spouses. Okay, you take care of the house and I'll take care of the cars. If you don't take care of the house, I'm not going to take care of the cars. Whatever the two things that you divide your responsibilities with in your family, we sometimes start looking at our relationships as contracts. Don't do dishes, I won't take out the trash. If you don't take care of the house to my satisfaction, then I'll consider your contract broken. And I can get away with not doing something myself. That's why we have so many divorces in the country today and in the world today, is because we look at relationships as a contractual obligation, as a set of responsibilities and commitments each side has, and if one side screws that up, guess what happens? The contract is broken. I don't have to be married to you anymore. You stop doing what you were supposed to. But we know that relationships, friendships, and marriages are based on a covenant and not on a contract. Covenants are different. They start with the other person's needs, with the other person's desires, with the other person's wants. And they, unlike a contract, covenants are based on a trust and not on limitations. They're based on other person's needs and not my own. They're based on trust and not conditions. They're based on commitments to one another, regardless, even though the other party screws things up, even when the other party messes things up and stumbles. Commitment to your friends, regardless of the circumstances. Commitment to your spouse, regardless of contractual obligations. That's the kind of relationship that Jonathan had with David. That's the kind of relationship. It was a friendship without benefits. It was a friendship without conditions. It was a friendship without getting some sort of monetary value out of it. It was a friendship that was based on a commitment to one another. In fact, Jonathan had everything to lose by being friends with David. It was to his disadvantage to have that kind of relationship. He would lose a kingdom if he supported David in his role and in his plans and in his desires and where God was leading him. And so that's the first thing I want you guys to remember today, is that real friendship, real relationships are always based on covenant type of commitments and not contractual type of commitments. Commitments based on trust and not limitations. The second thing, the second characteristic of a true friendship, the second characteristic of a type of friendship that Jonathan and David had is pointed out in the next passage. Let's read together chapter 23. Let's skip a couple of chapters. And I would encourage you to read those chapters that we're skipping right now before you go to your community groups this week, or as you're spending time on your own studying Scripture and spending time with God, because it really fills in a lot of the blanks. But if you take a look at chapter 23, verse 15 through 18, Saul pursues David. He is trying to kill him. And here's what happens. David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. So Saul is chasing David. It's gotten so bad that it's not just, I'll keep an eye on you anymore. David is in hiding. He's run away in the desert, and he's going from cave to cave trying to stay alive because he's afraid of Saul. Saul is going to kill him to protect what he's got. So David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also know this." And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained at Horesh, and Jonathan went home. And so we see that the story of David, the story of him becoming the king, continues. He's riding, he's in hiding, he's in caves, but we see that the friendship between Jonathan and David, it's in a different phase right now. They're not able to spend as much time with one another as they were when they were living in the palace together. But what we see is that as soon as Jonathan realized that David was in danger, he does what? He acts. He gets up and he goes to see David. Now, historians tell us that the distance between those two places where they were is about 30 miles. Now, 30 miles is a long way to walk. No cars, no airplanes, no helicopters that kings might travel in, no limos. This is dangerous roads. And so he gets up And he travels, and he walks, and he walks, and he walks. And when he gets there, the scripture says he was strengthening David. He was strengthening David and not himself. He had a reason to not act. He had a reason of saying, well, listen, I'm not doing it. My Father is doing it. And whatever he does, that's between him and God. If he's not following God's will, let him do it. I'm just going to do whatever. I'm going to either inherit the kingdom because of the sin of my father, or I'm not going to inherit the kingdom. But one way or the other, it's my Father's actions. That's what we often do in our lives, is we place responsibility on others. Here, we see that Jonathan, being a true friend, he wasn't passive. He was active. He took action. He went and he did something about it. And he did it not for himself. He did it strengthening David in God. This is important. Real friends act. Real friends are not passive. David is running far away from the king. Jonathan reaches out to him. Friends, I'm here to tell you that our lives are filled with people who might even consider to be our friends, but they're passive. They're passive. Maybe you are passive in your relationship with your friends. When you run into one another, you might even have a good conversation. You might even, help one another out once in a while. Maybe you'll even encourage them if they run into you, and you consider that individual your friend. But the reality is, when they gossip, or when somebody gossips about you with them, they don't stand up and say, stop. When they know that you need help with something, they don't walk 30 miles and say, I'm here, I want to help you. One of the stories that really encouraged me, there is a gentleman by the name of Ambassador Tony Hall, who is a Christian brother who's done a lot of great things for this country. And he had a weird friend. His friend's name was Nakamura. And his friend basically came up to him and said, listen, I just want to be your prayer partner. And I'll go wherever you go, and I'll pray with you before meetings. No benefits. No paid expense trips, but he knew that Tony Hall was in a position of being able to make some very important decisions that would impact many, many other people. And so Nakamura committed himself to traveling with this guy, and just before every important meeting that he had, every morning would start off and just praying with him. The kind of unconditional commitment to a friend that says, listen, I'm going to be there. I'm going to help, whatever it is. I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm going to commit myself based on a relationship of grace and love instead of contractual type of thing, saying, you do this for me and I'll do that for you. Our lives are filled with people, with acquaintances, with friends that are passive. But when their kingdom is on the line, when their livelihood is on the line, you know what happens? They don't run for 30 miles. They choose the kingdom instead of choosing friendships. Do you have a passive friend like that in your life? Or maybe you are the passive friend in your life. What are you choosing? The kingdom or covenant relationship? You see, Jonathan was not a passive friend. He took his time, he took his energy, he risked his kingdom, he risked everything that he was supposed to inherit, and he did that based on a covenant commitment. He was intentional about it. His friendship was not an accident. He didn't just run into David here and there and we're not running into each other anymore, so no big deal, do what you want. His friendship was full of intent. He gave him things that were representative. He gave him gifts and his own stuff that were symbolic. It was very important. He was intentional. But intentions are not everything. It's not that he wanted to be intentional about spending time with David, and therefore he spent time with David. We often talk about being intentional in our lives. We often talk about doing things with intent or with a certain motivation in our lives. But that's not all. You may have heard this saying that the road to hell is paved with what? Good intentions. Why? Because intentions are useless if they don't have a purpose attached to them. I may have the intention of spending time with a friend or with a family member or somebody, but if that intention does not point eventually to Christ, it has no purpose. It's an intention that over time is useless. It's an intention that needs to be leading to Christ, that has a purpose attached to it that makes sense. And so Jonathan had intentions. He was intentional about his friendship, but he wasn't just intentional for no purpose. He was intentional for a very specific purpose. And that purpose is specified in this verse. He went and he strengthened his hand in God. David was in trouble. David had a bunch of problems. And Jonathan went and encouraged him. He was intentional about it. And he also understood that where the direction that he was pointing David to mattered even more than being intentional about it. My question to you is, are you intentional about your relationships? And what's more important, are you intentional about your relationships, not just for the sake of secondary issues or spending time with one another or having fun or having great memories with your kids or whatever, but are you intentional about your relationships to the point that they point to Christ? Because then they have a purpose. Then they matter. And that's another characteristic of a true friendship. It's when intentional, when it is an intentional friendship that has a purpose, where it points to Christ. Jonathan's intentions mattered because he had a purpose. Major crisis in David's life. Jonathan shows up. And notice, he didn't minimize the problems. He didn't show up to David and said, listen, your problems don't matter. He didn't show up and say, listen, your problems, not a big deal. He didn't minimize them. He didn't ignore them. He understood the suffering or the difficulty that David was going through, but what he also understood that whatever was happening, his job as a friend was to point David to Christ. And he did that. He strengthened David in God. He pointed David to God. There was still fear. There was still discomfort. He was still in caves. But Jonathan was pointing David to a greater promise. He was pointing him to a promise that God gave David through Samuel when he promised him that he would be king. God promised David that he would be king. And that's the promise that Jonathan points David to. In a similar way, this story also points us to Jesus Christ. Just like Jonathan pointed David to God's promises, this greater story of friendship, it shows us Jesus Christ's friendship towards us. You see, Christian friendships, Christian relationships are not just for new believers. Relationships of friends are not just for people who just came to Christ and need to be strengthened. They're for everybody. And that's why we talk about community groups so much. That's why we talk about how life of a church really happens outside of a Sunday service, and that everything we see here is just the tip of the iceberg. And it's amazing and awesome and needed to get together corporately to worship God as a church family, to worship Him together as a large group. But where you live out most of your practical Christianity is not here in an hour and a half. You do it out there in the other 6 days and 22 hours. We're created to live in community with one another, to encourage one another, to live in a covenant relationship, not a contractual relationship, to love one another, to rebuke one another. And what better way to do that than to do it in a community group with other fellow believers who need the same thing as you do? What better way to point each other towards the promises of God? What better way to remind each other of Jesus' love towards one another? His love for us translates into our love for one another. But there is even a better example than Jonathan and David of what a real friendship, of what true friendship looks like. And that example is Jesus Christ himself. You see, today we're participating in communion, and this is, I keep saying, a core of what we believe as Christians, as followers of Jesus. And like Jonathan, Christ would come to serve and die at a great cost to himself. Jonathan was giving up a kingdom. Jesus Christ, being blameless and holy and perfect, he gave up his life on the cross. Like Jonathan, he would help those in need. Like Jonathan, he wouldn't just walk 30 miles to help a friend out, but he bridged an unbelievable, impossible distance between hell and heaven. Because we were not able to be in the presence of God with pure, holy God, because we're sinful people. And so he bridged that gap. He said, you know what, you don't deserve it. But now we're made righteous in the eyes of God the Father by the blood that Jesus Christ has spilled on the cross for us. Because of his grace, because of his love, because of his mercy. Jonathan gave up his place as in line for his kingdom that he was waiting to inherit. Jesus bought us, purchased us a place in his Father's kingdom and gave it to us. Like Jonathan, Jesus took our cause and made it his. Didn't have to. There was no benefit for him. But lovingly, with grace, with mercy, he did what we could not do on the cross. And he is the ultimate friend that any of us could possibly want in our lives. And so today, as we participate in communion, I would ask that the brothers who will be partaking in communion come forward and get ready. And over the next few minutes, I just would encourage you to reflect and meditate on this idea that maybe the relationships in our lives have been more contractual than covenant-based. And maybe we even look at what Jesus Christ has done on the cross for us more as a contractual thing and saying, listen, you know what? I'm going to come to church on Sundays because I kind of have to. You know, that's my side of the deal. That's my part of the deal because of what he did on the cross. Instead of doing it in love and in desire to be with fellow brothers and sisters and worshiping God corporately. Maybe we serve in ministry because we have this sense of guilt of saying, you know what, I'm going to do it because everybody else does it and I'm considered a bad Christian. That's what's going to motivate me. Instead of doing it out of the understanding that, listen, God has entrusted me with something, and being a good steward of what he gave me, I'm going to use that to serve others. To be more like Jesus, who came to serve, who came to die, who gave up his life and purchased us a place in his Father's kingdom. And so let us stand. In the next 2 minutes, I would ask that each of you pray. Just talk to God with your eyes closed and with your heads bowed, and reflect on what he has done on the cross for us.
May your love reign.